Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Luis Lugo, Director of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, which is a project of the Pew Research Center. The center is a nonpartisan organization and does not take positions on policy debates. We're delighted to have as our special guest today Michael Gerson, who will discuss his new book, Heroic Conservatism: Why Republicans Need to Embrace America's Ideals and Why They Deserve to Fail If They Don't. This event is part of an ongoing forum series bringing together journalists and policy leaders to discuss timely topics at the intersection of religion and public affairs. But the format for today, as you have noticed, is different from our regular press luncheons. You see, we've been going through our own conversion of sorts here at the forum. It's driven by my staff's ongoing strong proselytizing efforts directed at techno-peasants like myself on behalf of the gospel of new web technologies. They have succeeded. So this is designed as what they call a virtual event, which means that we are videotaping it for our website so that a much broader audience will have a chance to benefit from this conversation. They like to think of it as our new PewTube strategy. With that said, I would like to thank the real life people who are here, including our journalist friends, who constitute our intimate studio audience. We also have invited a select group of bloggers and journalists to submit questions in advance, and they'll be brought up in the Q&A period. The forum's partner in this series are Mike Cromarty of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, who is by no accident to Michael Gerson's right, and E.J. Dionne of the Brookings Institution and the Washington Post, sitting to Michael's left. Both are senior advisors to the Pew Forum, and together they will help guide the conversation. Again, many thanks for coming and for being part of our experiment. Thank you. Mike.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you very much. Well, it's my privilege to introduce Michael Gerson. And let me do it this way by telling you that Michael Gerson currently is the Roger Hertog Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations here in Washington, D.C. And his work there focuses on global health and development, religion and foreign policy, and the democracy agenda. But why we're here today is because of the new book that Michael Gerson has written called Heroic Conservatism. Besides writing that book, Michael is now a syndicated columnist with the Washington Post. His column appears twice a week in the Washington Post. He's a contributor to Newsweek magazine. Before joining the Council on Foreign Relations, Michael was a top aide to President George W. Bush as assistant to the President for Policy and Strategic Planning. Prior to that appointment, he served in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Presidential Speechwriting, and an Assistant to the President for Speechwriting and Policy Advisor. He joined the Bush presidential campaign in the spring of 1999 as the chief speechwriter for then candidate Bush. Before that, he was previously a senior editor covering politics for U.S. News and World Report. He was a speechwriter and a policy advisor before that to Jack Kemp, and then to the Senator Bob Dole in his campaign in 1996. And before that, he served as a policy director for Senator Dan Coates. We're delighted to have Michael Gerson here today at the Pew Forum to celebrate his new book, Heroic Conservatism. And the first question for Michael Gerson will come from my colleague, E.J. Dionne.
Thank you. It's good to be here and good to be with both mics. I think both mics are to my right. And I'm honored to be with them. Let me just ask the most basic question. How is heroic conservatism different from all other kinds of conservatism? How is it different from neoconservatism, from paleoconservatism, from just plain conservatism? What makes this distinctive?
Yeah. Before I get to that, I want to thank the Pew Forum for this opportunity. I always remember that immediately after I did my first Pew event, down in Florida, I had a heart attack. And
We like to think you survived and prospered after the heart attack.
exactly. And it may have been the journalist questions, or it may have been the fact that we were on a topless beach, I think. I mean, that's true. Right off the hotel. But let me answer that question in a couple of ways. The book Heroic Conservatism tries to answer. Tries to answer that question with a couple of different challenges.
It was thinking about the beach.
Right, exactly, yeah. The first one is an ideological challenge to Republicans and conservatives. It's a rejection, heroic conservatism is a rejection of libertarian and traditional anti-government ideology in favor of an approach of kind of conservatism of the common good influenced by Catholic social thought. So it tries to take the principles of solidarity with the poor and the weak seriously, which is true both in issues of poverty, race, but also on pro-life issues, in my view. But also takes the principle of limited government subsidiarity seriously, trying to both respect and strengthen mediating institutions as a primary goal of public policy. So the goal in that context is to look for ways to use conservative and free market methods to achieve goals of social justice. And that is a debate within the Republican Party currently, a debate about markets and the debate about the role of government and a lot of other things. The book then provides, I think, a significant challenge, ideological challenge to Democrats and to liberals, particularly on the role of religion in our common life. It argues that religious people and reform movements have been one of the most essential elements of kind of reform in American history. Both on kind of what would be conceived as left and right. It essentially argues that there is a type of conservatism, or at least a type of approach, often, not always, but often by religious people in American history, asking the question, what are the great issues, moral issues of our time? And some people answered that in the context of abolition, and some answered it in the context of the reform of working conditions in the Industrial Revolution. Some answered that in the context of the Civil Rights Movement. Some answered that in the context of the pro-life movement. And that's often a religiously informed vision of human rights and dignity. And so this is a type of conservatism that also asks that question in our time. And I come up with a few answers in the context of the book that have to do with wealth and poverty, that have to do with disease and development abroad, which have to do with the humane bioethics and other issues on this front. And then, to some extent, the book is a challenge to all Americans. That even though it's possible, not even though, I think we can learn the difficult foreign policy lessons of the last several years. And there have been some difficult lessons that I talk about in the book. But still have a kind of moral internationalism that takes American duties in the world seriously on human rights and on AIDS and malaria and human trafficking and a variety of issues that I think are increasingly engaging religious people in America on these issues, particularly African issues. And so, I guess the sum total of this would be that form of conservatism which takes the radical demands of human rights and dignity at home and abroad and tries to apply that in a variety of different settings.
I know EJ has a follow-up, but before he has a follow-up, I have a follow-up. And that would be this, Michael, quickly, if I could. You were recently on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and I'm going to ask the question that he asked you, which what you've just described is the Democratic Party. And your reaction to that is what?
My reaction to that is, if your question assumes that goals of social justice are Democratic goals, then that would be true. But I don't make that assumption.
Many people do, though.
I think that those are shared social goals, but it does point out a cleavage, and I believe that bureaucratic centralization and kind of arrogant government have not achieved those goals very well. I mean, by that critique. I'm for welfare reform, you know, a variety of measures on crime. I mean, these are things. These are essentially the application of conservative ideas to achieve what are traditionally seen as liberal ends. Okay. And so I guess I would reject that, but it does expose a cleavage, because there are certain types of conservatism that argue that the definition of justice is the impartial application of rules.
Period.
Okay? Yeah, meaning the rule of law and markets. And that if everyone has an equal chance and the rules are correctly enforced, then you've achieved social justice. Okay? I think the tradition that I'm arguing here is quite different. You know, Catholic social thought, and I think the mainstream of the kind of Judeo-Christian tradition has argued that social outcome is an actual outcome for the poor and the weak. That actually the justice of a society is determined by the treatment of its weakest members. And so that does change to some extent your goals and motivations in politics. And I don't think it makes you a liberal, but I think it's different than some other conservative approach.
By the way, if I could just say as a fellow Protestant, there is such a thing as Protestant social thought, you would agree.
Yeah, I mean,
keep talking about Catholic
Kuyper and others, you know, and there's plenty of models that evangelicals have, but you know, there's so many evangelicals like me who went to Capitol Hill and were casting around for a kind of construct to explain what it means to be a person of conscience in politics, and came to John Paul II and the tradition of Roman Catholic social thought. And it has a consequence. It leaves you with a kind of philosophy, from my perspective, because it doesn't dictate a political ideology. That's not what this tradition does. But it does dictate certain social goals of justice. And then, you know, and it's left me believing that it's possible, and arguing that it's possible, to be a supporter of free markets, and also believe in helping African kids in active ways, to be a social conservative, which I am, and to believe that in helping, in confronting these durable problems of race and poverty in this country, that I think neither party has been particularly responsible on. And so, yeah, there are Protestant traditions, but the predominant one in our time has been a Catholic tradition.
Just so everyone knows, we're not going to monopolize this. We want to open it up, but there are a few questions we want to ask. I also have some from the bloggers, so I may combine a number of the questions I wanted to ask you. The broad question, well, I once told you, Mike, that if President Bush actually acted on all of the Catholic social thought you put in his speeches, I might have to vote for him. But I never, fortunately, perhaps I never had this problem.
Otherwise, you'd have a heart attack.
And, you know, I wanted you to judge the administration by your standards in this book. And in particular, and David Quo, as you know, made this point, you know, if you go back to the very beginning of the administration, when given a choice on the tax program for all these tax cuts to the wealthy, or including, and this is classic conservatism, a substantial tax break for charitable giving, the tax cuts for the wealthy stayed, and the tax breaks for charitable giving never made it into the bill the administration put forward. Is that at all consistent with this vision? So I'd like you to critique, perhaps, as well as, if you wish, support the administration's connection to this argument.
I make the critique in the book in pretty comprehensive ways. But you know, my basic summary, and I'll deal with faith-based first, because this has been was an animating principle behind the president's run for office in the year 2000, an essential element of what we call compassionate conservatism. And I guess what I found, because government can be deeply frustrating, is that when we pushed for tax changes that would encourage charitable giving, deductibility, deductibility for non-itemizers and kind of other things, that there was absolutely no interest among Republican congressional leadership on Capitol Hill. It was a...
But you had the choice of putting it in your own bill. They could have thrown it out if they
Well,
wanted.
but you negotiate these things, even what you put in your own bill, you know, as you go into the process. That's the reality. And so John DiIulio and a lot of other people, you know, pushed hard up on the Hill to try to, you know, gain some interest in these ideas. And you had almost, monolithic indifference on these questions. So, you know, that's the reality. On domestic policy, a president's constrained by the Congress. Okay, should the administration have pushed more? You could probably make a case that the legislative shop accepted that consensus rather than challenge it. Okay, and that there might have been more emphasis on it. But the reality there is then the president eventually turned to a series of executive orders to try to do what he could, because that's the power he had. To open up contracting in the departments and to kind of make sure there's fair treatment for faith-based institutions and the provision of social services. So it ended up being a mixed record. I think that there was very little action on, particularly early on those congressional, on issues that required congressional approval, because there was almost no constituency for these ideas. It's a shame. I think it's a problem. The Republican Party had accepted George Bush, but had not been transformed by that ideology. And we found tremendous obstacles when we got there. And, you know, but foreign policy, of course, in a certain way, the president has a much freer hand, for good and ill, on these things. And that's an area where I saw, you know, a lot of compassionate conservatism eventually in action. You know, I mean, the president really, through his own interest and you know, pushed for, you know, a $15 billion AIDS program in Africa, the largest initiative on a single disease in human history. You know, pushed for the president's malaria initiative, and I think did what he could on the faith-based initiative, given the constraints of an unwilling Congress. So I view that more as a mixed situation. In the aftermath of the Bush administration, one of the good things is that there are almost, I have the figure in the book, but maybe 40, more than 40 states now have faith-based offices, Democratic and Republican, where they're trying to find ways to strengthen community and faith-based institutions to confront problems.
On a state level.
State level. Yeah. And, you know, and many of the departments now have it, and I think there's been real progress in making sure that there's kind of equal treatment, that religious institutions have not been discriminated against. But but certainly I'm frustrated on that front about what the Congress was willing to do, and then how the administration reacted to that. You know, in not, I don't think, as being as vigorous as it could have been in challenging that indifference.
Right, and I think the other question, but I won't press you on it now, is the question of where the administration chose to put resources. And there was a great debate over whether, in fact, even the faith-based groups ended up with more money at the end of this process. And I know those numbers are argued about, but where the administration's priorities were not clearly in the direction of the least and the poorest among us.
Well, it depends, of course, if you're talking about tens of millions of the elderly that have prescription drug coverage because the president pushed for it, and in fact, very few other Republicans would. Or if you're talking about minority children in public schools who've made you know, some of the largest gains in decades because of No Child Left Behind. Or you're going to eventually talk about 2 million people in Africa who are going to be receiving ARVs, you know, antiretroviral drugs. I mean, those kind of accomplishments in the Bush administration have sometimes been overshadowed by Iraq, but they're not eliminated by Iraq. And I think I think that there were some significant accomplishments on many of those fronts, accomplishments of social justice, in my view.
And how much, Michael, did 9/11 have an influence on the faith-based initiative?
Well, it had a huge influence on domestic policy. You know, I mean,
it shifted everything.
One of the lessons when you're fairly close to, you know, kind of what's going on at the White House is that all policy competes for the attention of 6 or 12 people to determine what the priorities are, and the you know, the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan and a lot of other things really did, in fairly fundamental ways, shift the direction of the administration. There's no question about that. Drained some of the domestic policy energy. Eventually, of course, significantly tightened the budget situation as we went along. And so, I talk about in the book, I think in an honest way, it's not a tell-all, but an honest way, that there were increasing frustrations over time on some of these type of agenda items, both about the kind of traction within the system, but also the financial resources that we had to work with.
I'm going to ask my last question for this round so we can go out there, but I would like you to talk about Iraq, which plays an important role in your book, and heroic conservatism. I think the title is also linked to your sense of the United States' obligation to push democracy in the world, and I think many people believe that, but worry that this particular Iraq policy may even have discredited this idea. And I wanted to ask you, you're critical in certain respects of the Iraq policy pursued by the administration. In particular, I would ask, how heroic was it to wage a war without asking people to pay for it, to have optimistic assumptions going in, the whole question of whether enough troops were sent there in the first place. Could you, I could go on, but I won't. Could you just talk about your own take?
Actually, I'm happy to go on.
Could you talk about your own take on where Iraq leaves us, and from?
Well, it's one of the serious concerns of the book is that you could get, because of serious problems and mistakes in Iraq policy, that you could get a serious backlash against the kind of moral internationalism that I argue for. And I think that would be a disaster for American policy in a lot of ways that I argue about. But it's also understandable in the context of Iraq. I go through in the book. One of the nice things about writing a book is it gives you a chance to put your own thoughts together. When you experience events, it's hard to interpret them. And then, but there were at least 3 theories of the Iraq War. The first one was just liberate and leave. I mean, there was an assumption that our military would be down to 30 or 40,000 troops by the end of the year, and that proved to be an unrealistic assumption. It was an assumption that you could take off the top of the pyramid of Iraqi society and other institutions would remain in place, and that it would be possible to have a quick transition. And it turned out not to be true. There was then really a second theory of the Iraq War, which was that we would push for political progress, and that would result in security gains as you bound the Sunnis to the process. And we had a series of false highs, which seemed to justify it. When you're sitting in the White House, it looked like there was evidence that this was working because we had purple fingers and approval of constitutions and increases in Sunni participation in each election and all these sort of things. But the assumption actually turned out to be false, or at least premature, because all those gains, which were genuine, did not result in security progress. And then after the Samarra mosque bombing, and even some before it, you had the growth of sectarian violence, which really undermined a lot of what we were trying to do. And then you had the switch to a third theory of the Iraq War, which is you have to establish security in Anbar and Baghdad and other places in order for any political progress to take place, which is a much more classic counterinsurgency strategy, and which I think is working in a lot of ways. I also say in the book that I wish those adjustments had happened earlier. So I make all those criticisms, but we're still faced with the reality in American foreign policy that so many of the future threats that we face are rooted in failed and despairing societies. Okay. In governments that can't control or police their people, control their border, in failed states, in kind of hopeless parts of the world, hopeless, stagnant, authoritarian parts of the world, particularly in the Arab Middle East. And you see the development of problems when it comes to not just terrorism, but that's certainly true, but on disease, and on criminal gangs, and on drug cartels, and on refugees, and all these very difficult problems. So, you know, the reality here is that America, more than at any other time in our history, has a direct national interest in the hope and progress of people in other lands. And I hope that Iraq doesn't obscure that, you know, because Iraq does not change that reality. And America may need to be more engaged on these issues in promoting human rights, in promoting rule of law, in promoting women's empowerment, in promoting in fighting disease, all these kind of issues that in the long run are really essential to our interests and an expression of American ideals. And so that is one of the arguments of the book is, can we have a realistic view about some of the problems about Iraq and other things, and still, you know, still retain a kind of simple courage and a good cause about America's role in the world.
Michael, you have a chapter in the book called "Has the War in Iraq Killed Idealism?"
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to confront it directly, and my answer is, the politics of it is iffy, but it can't have. It can't have, because first of all, we have great purposes in the world that I've seen myself. I mean, how important they can be. You know, I talk about in the book, you know, my best experience at the White House was was watching the President of the United States make the decision for the emergency plan for AIDS relief. And then being in Ethiopia and Kenya and Namibia and South Africa and a lot of other places, seeing the results. You know, little kids who are alive because the American people are generous, even though they don't know it for the most part.
By the way, did the president get a lot of criticism from the right for that money?
Well, at the time, the financial situation was a little better, you know.
The dollar went farther, too.
Yeah. But that's a case where he's gotten policy criticism from left and right, okay, on trying to export the culture war to Africa in a lot of ways.
Now, why would the left be upset about $15 billion going down?
Because they think that we don't spend enough on condoms and you know, other prevention techniques, when we've had a 70% increase in the focus countries in condom distribution. And the right thinks that, you know, all we do is give out condoms. And the reality there is, when you get close to the ground, condoms are an essential prevention technique. I mean, if you're talking particularly discordant couples and, you know, older kids in the 18, 19, 20 years old, you know, condoms can make a difference between life and death. So we've had those arguments, but actually not too many arguments about total level of spending. There's one story I tell in the book in the aftermath of Katrina, where someone from one of the conservative Washington think tanks, you know, argued that the president needs to give up something he wants. Why not the AIDS program, in order to pay for Katrina?
You're going to name names?
No, but I wouldn't. But it's the kind of case where, you know, where a skepticism of government, which is a conservative trait, can be a brutal indifference to the consequences of reductions in government. And I think, you know, that needs to be confronted too, even though there's not much pushback on those issues in the Republican Party right now.
Michael, we're getting ready to go to our audience to ask questions, but one of the bloggers is Terry Mattingly from GetReligion.com, and Terry wants to know, do you have several examples, current examples of conservatives that get what you're saying in your book, Heroic Conservatism?
And as Terry says, real names and then defend the choices.
Let's see if we can get to 5. I'm not sure.
Well, he asked for 5, and I edited to say several.
All right, yeah.
I think they're all blurbing the back of your book.
Right, yeah. First of all, I just did a column the other day on Mike Huckabee. He is a very strong social conservative who, when I interviewed him last week, said, yeah, I'm a conservative, but if that means that I don't talk about the poor and the hungry, then I don't want to be anything like that. He's an economic populist who argues that we have you know, significant kind of digression in you know, kind of middle-class income over the last few decades that Republicans need to address. He's has some of this element. So it's not unrepresented in the field. I look at somebody like Rick Warren, who represents a very different model of social engagement on a variety of issues among conservative Protestants, who we're seeing kind of a head-snapping generational shift between the generation of Dobson and Robertson to people like Rick Warren, who is motivated particularly on African issues and domestic aids and issues of racial justice, and doesn't see any contradiction with being pro-life and a lot of these other kind of basic social values. I'll tell you.
We got two behind him, if we were keeping track.
Yeah.
That's two.
I don't know if I'm going to get the guy. I don't know if I'm
By the way, I
going
just want to say about Governor Huckabee, his campaign was not doing very well until we had him here for lunch at the forum.
Right, and he didn't have a heart attack.
And it sort of took off right after that lunch.
Sam Brownback, who's dropped out of the race, is the leader of many of these ideas on Capitol Hill, the leader on malaria issues in Africa, the leader on human trafficking. He certainly represents, he wrote an article in the Post the other day, essentially calling for his version of a consistent ethic of life, which sounds very much like Cardinal Bernardine, So I think that you see that influence. I'll tell you something strange. When I talk with young evangelicals,
These are not the people at the top of the pack right now, though.
Well, no, I wouldn't put Giuliani in this category or some others.
Right.
But I would mention when I talk with evangelicals, young evangelicals, students at Wheaton College, where I was just there, or Harvard, where I spent some time, up at the Kennedy School. And you ask them, who's your model of social engagement? Who do you really, believe? And they almost uniformly say Bono. And that to me is...
But he can't run for president.
Right, exactly. He's a foreigner. But it is an interesting sign of a shift, okay? That a lot of young evangelicals want to be proud of their political engagement. They want it to be broader than the tradition has come before it. And Bono actually plays an important role, as African issues have played an important mobilizing role on a lot of these things. What does that mean? Is there a kind of constituency for these things? Well, I think it's more of a tendency than a movement right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's not a whole lot of institutions that represent this kind of thought. It's certainly not kind of traditional conservative institutions. But I think that there's a kind of market or a kind of hunger for a politics fairly broadly in America that's oriented not towards just primarily towards people's interests or their resentments, but towards their aspirations. At least I hope that's true. So.
It should be said for the record that Mike went to Wheaton, which regards Harvard as the Wheaton of the Ivy League.
Right.
A fine school. Jay Mayer? We need a mic just for the benefit of the...
Here it comes. And then, Kate.
I wondered how you reconcile the vision of what you described as a religiously informed vision of human rights and dignity with the record of the Bush administration on treatment of suspects in the war on terror, where you might place them outside of the reach of the Geneva Conventions and the visits from the Red Cross, and in sort of unlimited detention, and even maybe waterboard them or whatever else they've been doing that we don't really know all the details of. Does that comport with that vision that you've got? And if not, was it an area of tension for you within the administration?
Let me tell you, I think in the second inaugural, in a lot of the speeches that we did, that the president put human rights and human dignity at the centerpiece of American foreign policy in almost completely unprecedented ways. And the reality there is, I remember coming in the morning of the Abu Ghraib pictures. And a friend of mine who was involved in the democracy agenda, being more depressed than I've ever seen him, saying, this undermines everything we've done. And that to me, was a terrible, disappointment. I think Abu Ghraib played an extraordinary role in trying to confirming the world's worst suspicions, even when they were completely unjustified. And that's the role of symbols in politics, and it was a terrible failure. The reality, though, on some of these other measures, and these were not kind of issues that I was directly involved in the policy debates, but it was. First, I have 2 points. One of them is it's much easier to make some of these criticisms when you don't have a direct responsibility for the security of the American people, and when you're in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when we expected more attacks at any moment. Okay. So you have to understand psychological context in a lot of these issues. But I've come to the view and written about it that particularly Guantanamo and the legal structure surrounding the war on terror has become a liability to American interests. And that I think it's perfectly reasonable for the administration to say there is a series of measures that you take, ad hoc measures, in the immediate aftermath of a tremendous national crisis in which thousands of Americans were killed, but eventually have to be put on a much firmer legal basis. Now that some of that has come with the Army guidelines and a lot of the progress has been made. Some of it has come, of course, as the result of judicial decisions rather than being chosen. So, but I do think that we've reached a point where I think America would benefit from a judicial structure in the war on terror that would eventually report to the federal court system. Okay.
Does this mean you're sympathetic to some of Jack Goldsmith's critiques? It sounds a little like him.
No, I don't know if I've been directly influenced by them. It seems to me like, I think the reality is that we had, in the aftermath of 9/11, we developed this legal regimen that just depends on kind of executive authority. Okay. And as I said, I think that's justifiable in the initial stages of this. But I think eventually you need the Congress to pass a law that puts this within a judicial framework that reports to judges, just like FISA does and a lot of these other kind of measures do, so that you have a kind of a judicial review, a reliable judicial review process. But you don't essentially try in normal courts for terrorist cases, which would be impossible. Okay? So, that to me, I think that's probably where we should be. So.
Next, Kathy Kay from BBC. Wait for the microphone, please.
Am I allowed a two-part question? I know the President doesn't like it, but perhaps Mr. Gerson.
You're allowed a two-part.
He's more compassionate.
Yeah, that's all right.
You mentioned the second inaugural, and I have to say this week, watching the pictures in Pakistan, I keep thinking of the second inaugural. I'm wondering how, and I remember listening to the second inaugural and thinking, I can see how this plays in America, and I can see that many people around the world are going to hate this address.
Right.
And part of the reason they hate it is because they look at somewhere like Pakistan and say, there is an inevitable accusation of hypocrisy.
Of course, yeah.
How does your vision of American foreign policy deal with the realities of somewhere like Pakistan?
Well, I actually try to deal with it in the book because an idealistic American foreign policy is always going to have elements of hypocrisy in a certain way. The reality is after the 9/11, we were not going to pursue immediate elections in Saudi Arabia, which would have resulted in a worse outcome. We were not going to there's a cost to immediate and destabilizing social change in a lot of these questions. But of course, this has been a traditional criticism of idealistic American foreign policy. Lincoln was not, an immediate abolitionist, and America in the Cold War, even at its most idealistic, had to make deals with a variety of interests because in the cause of stability. My concern is when you abandon the goals and you try not to move towards them. Pakistan is a very difficult case. In the aftermath of the emergency decree, you're faced. The administration is faced with a choice. You either encourage the army to overthrow Musharraf, or you try to get him back on track to move in a democratic direction. And they chose the second option as being more, be less destabilizing. It's hard to argue with. The real question there is whether they should have pushed harder earlier for the last couple of years on a variety of issues, using the leverage of aid and other things, on madrasas and the Al-Qaeda and a lot of other issues. And I think actually you can probably make that argument. But I think that the second inaugural is sometimes, a deeply misunderstood speech. The speech actually addresses a number of audiences directly by name in the speech. I mean, some of them are dissidents saying, we're not going to abandon you. But some of them are authoritarian governments, which we kind of euphemistically say had long habits of control, and says that if you'll embark on some of this path, if you'll even start reform, we'll go along with you. We'll aid these efforts. And so, the Cold War is the example. I think that our idealism was essential to the outcome. I mean, I think that dissidents, in the Gulag knew, that Ronald Reagan was on their side. But that didn't mean that he had to engage in kind of immediate, radical, and destabilizing confrontation in order to achieve these goals. I think with a lot of countries, it's possible to have a mature two-track relationship. So, for example, I always argued that with China, for example, that we don't want to have the reemergence of superpower rivalry. We don't want to, embitter them in ways that are self-destructive. But the State Department often argued that that means that you can never talk about human rights in China. And my perspective was really, well, when we didn't talk about human rights in China, China would, tend to pursue its interests. And when we did talk about human rights in China, China tended to pursue its interests. Okay? And in the long run, it's probably good to have a consistent message to make clear to religious dissidents and others that rights advocates, legal advocates, that we think they're eventually going to be the rulers of their country, and that and that America cares about their lives and interests. I helped organize them a meeting with President Bush and some members of PEN, Chinese PEN, and in the yellow oval over at the residence, and the State Department warned of apocalyptic consequences to our relationship, and of course there weren't.
Against meeting.
Yeah, against meeting.
Yeah.
And of course there weren't, and it was deeply encouraging it goes out through the network of dissidents all over China when the President of the United States does something like that.
Are there dissidents he can meet with now from Pakistan?
Well, I think it would be a good idea.
Bring them in.
Could I follow up on
Sure,
that? Because
sure.
when you were, first of all, the Cold War, we were obviously on the right side of history, but we actually overthrew democratically elected governments, occasionally to install dictatorships. And when you're talking about sometimes we've got to make hard choices and not live up to our ideals. If somebody wanted to be skeptical, they'd say, isn't that old-fashioned realism dressed up in this nice democratic clothes? Right. Why is that not the case? Why is what you just said not really a form of realism with sort of a nice, lovely rhetoric attached to it?
Well, once again, maybe I've seldom gotten that accusation, actually. It's more the other side, given the fact I'm at the Council on Foreign Relations, and there's, some significant criticism of
the Illuminati.
Right, of kind of idealistic language in foreign affairs. Yeah. But, I guess that's a case where the best foreign policy, and I think Reagan foreign policy, I think Kennedy foreign policy, I think Truman foreign policy, I think Roosevelt foreign policy, was idealistic about ends and realistic about means. You can't be anything else when you're President of the United States and you're pursuing the defense of the Constitution and the protection of the American people. And sometimes that requires, as you said, it requires difficult choices. But I guess what we were asserting, and you see it explicitly in the second inaugural, is that American interests, let me put it this way, particularly in the Middle East, but also in other unstable parts of the world, the status quo is not sustainable. That it actually is actively producing people and ideologies that kill our citizens and will do so in greater numbers as their technology increases. Okay? So that is a fairly radical foreign policy insight. That what we see, particularly in the Arab Middle East, but in other places, is not stable or sustainable. It, in fact, is increasingly unbalanced and dangerous. And if we don't do something about it, by changing by helping insofar as we can, because our levers are limited, but by encouraging the kind of social change that results in more hopeful societies, that there are going to be terrible results in the future. That's a pretty strong claim, and
Michael, the President and the Secretary of State right now are getting hammered on that very point. So what is your counsel to them? Be patient?
My counsel to them, as I write in the book, is that they ought to take, I'm, for example, disappointed on Egypt policy.
Yeah.
I think that there's a cost to America right now in Egypt, not for being too idealistic, but for actually being inconsistent with our own ideals.
Inconsistent with our own
ideals. Yeah. And I think that there's a number of dissidents and reformers that we have actively encouraged over the years in Egypt that now feel pretty disillusioned with American policy. So I'm perfectly willing to make those criticisms. Because when America was more consistently applying these ideals, we had some extraordinary things happen in the year 2005, which wasn't that long ago. People talk about the Arab Spring, and there were changes in former Soviet Union, dramatic changes, significant amount of progress.
Temporary.
Yeah, but not all of it temporary. It was I think it's an indication that when you can get some results when you emphasize these ideals.
Kathy had a follow-up question.
Still got the mic, so I'm going to hold on to it.
You have the mic, yes.
On the sort of question of American values, how does a heroic conservative implement your ideals abroad without increasing anti-Americanism around the world? There is this perception in many countries that America is trying in an imperialist way to impose its values on other countries. So how does somebody following your model implement your ideals without pushing that feeling up and increasing what you've said is a real risk in the Middle East of more people wanting to kill you?
Yeah, well, the Middle East is, because of kind of unique history, is a difficult problem. But let me start with another area.
Well, that's where the anti-Americanism is greatest.
It is. It's absolutely true. But let me maybe start with a hopeful example. Because, the Pew Global Attitudes survey indicates that I think it's 7 out of the top 10 countries with favorable views of America are in Africa. Okay? I don't think it's there are a lot of reasons for that, but I don't think it's a coincidence that we've tripled development assistance to Africa. We've pursued, major, efforts to fight disease, and this is it's one of the few places in the world, first of all, where you go to remote villages up in the tea country of Kenya, and people know the phrase PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which no American knows. Okay, where I've been one of the few places in the world where when people find out that I have worked for the president, they chant his name.
Where is this again?
You ought to go cut some brush there.
Right. Yeah.
Be glad to.
So, if from one perspective, our problems haven't been as difficult in the, in that setting, but it's certainly possible to pursue you know, what I argued within the administration as kind of the public diplomacy of deeds. These things eventually matter, you know. I met in Juba in South Sudan a woman who said, I still believe in the country of John Kennedy. And it was because of the Peace Corps, you know. You know, this was on a food line, you know, in the middle of, you know, of southern Sudan. And these kind of things can actually make I think they can make a difference. So I'm an idealist in that basis. I don't, for example, believe that, and I made the argument, that we've done enough on the development side, for example, in the Arab Middle East in particular. You know, I look at, for all the problems that some conservatives have with, like, the EU, okay, you know, at least the EU is offering Turkey tangible economic benefits, okay, if they pursue changes in rule of law and religious liberty and, you know, all these sort of things, okay. And that's something I'm not sure we've done. I mean, we talk about a lot of these themes about rule of law and markets and kind of liberal trading order and other things. And we've done some of it with free trade agreements with Jordan and, you know, and Morocco and other places. But that seems to me, you know, maybe a promising, you know, area. But I don't think we can, you know, give up on the notion that there are, you know, I guess I don't buy the notion that if America were to speak out, you know, strongly on Ayman Noor, that we're going to turn Egypt against us. Okay? That seems to me just a principled stand that would actually be helpful. You know, we tried to make very clear in the rhetoric that when we talk about democratic progress in these countries, we're not talking about the American model, you know, which we certainly haven't seen in Afghanistan and other places, but they have their own kind of traditions and history and habits that feed into, you know, self-government, even when it's not one man, one vote, even when it has kind of different elements to it. And so, you know, I think we have tried, you know, the administration attempted to have a very sophisticated view on these things. Let me give you one more example. I became convinced when I was at the White House that maybe one of the best things that we can do on this agenda is to promote women's empowerment in these situations. You know, to achieve the kind of lasting cultural change that we would hope for. First of all, I saw it in the context of disease. You know, the prevention approaches A, B, and C, abstinence, be faithful, and condoms. And when women have no power in a relationship, none of those things work. It has no effect. And so, but you know, America could be involved in the protection of women in legal, you know, promoting the protection of women in legal contexts. You know, reform of laws. We can be involved in economic empowerment of women. We can be involved in, you know, the education of young women. And those kind of things, I think, have tremendous eventual social effects to more kind of equal, equitable, hopeful societies. Now, of course, there would be some kind of, you know, backlash to those ideas, but I think that they're ultimately in our interest. And I think on this agenda, you know, I think the next president, in a lot of ways, Republican or Democrats, always gets you know, a fresh start on some of these things. So.
Okay, let's go to this.
Could I just say, could somebody warn us at 10
Mark.
minutes, because I want to get, there are some very good online questions here that I want to get in before we go. So let's have a couple more here. Let me ask those afterward.
Okay, then Eleanor and Mark. If we can hold for the mic, Eleanor.
The intervention of the Republican Congress and the President in the Terry Schiavo case, was that heroic conservatism, or was that political pandering?
I don't know. It's a really tough one. But, you know, the motivation there was, you know, you can disagree about the application, but the motivation is the protection of the handicapped. You know, and that you can kind of, as I said, you can question whether this is the circumstance of this case justified it. But you know, this is. I mean, I have a genuine, kind of deep concern that that we are moving in the realm of bioethics and medical ethics, towards eugenics in this country. We have a situation where there are very few Down syndrome children born anymore, and because of genetics screening, and I also don't want to get into a circumstance where we weaken kind of legal protections for the severely mentally handicapped. Now, there's obviously a huge debate over when, life-sustaining care, should be withdrawn, and those are not easy medical questions. But to say that there's no element of law in these things, I think is a very dangerous thing.
Well, could I press you on this? Because I agree with a lot of what you just said, but the specific question, in retrospect, you yourself, not speaking for the administration, do you think that was a wise decision, or do you now think it was a mistake in that particular case?
Well, I guess the advantage that I have of not speaking for the administration is I can say I'm just not sure. I mean, I honestly don't know. This is I think, as a general principle, that you don't make the most difficult medical ethical decisions in retrospect. That this was a case where I think at least some of the testing afterwards indicated that she had very little brain activity. And under those circumstances, if you knew that beforehand, okay, in a decisive way.
But that is what the evidence showed beforehand. I mean, in other words, the thing about and I say this as somebody who's opposed to doctor-assisted suicide, and I thought it was a disaster to make the Schiavo case the centerpiece of this. Right. I could not understand the thinking of the right to life movement in this case. Put aside, the other point of view in this case. And
but there was,
because the evidence was
but as I understand
it,
that there were disputes about the evidence.
Yes, that's a lot of disputes.
And so that's so it really would depend. I think that people that have lost higher brain functions are not alive. I mean, I think that's a fact that you have to deal with, and it's sometimes very, very difficult. I also believe in the contact in a natural death. I think that's a very kind of religious concept. That extraordinary care, in cases where someone has no chance of recovery, is not a moral requirement. But I think it's a genuine legal question if you have a dispute within a family about whether someone is alive or not, and that if there were evidence on both sides. I'm just not sure there were. I mean, I just don't know the status of the evidence well enough.
Okay, Mark, you've been waiting patiently, and then we'll go AJ after Mark's question.
Yeah, let me go to that.
You spoke earlier about the application of free market or conservative means to achieve ends of social justice. I wonder, on the domestic side, can you give me a concrete example or two of what that would mean around an issue like climate change or urban poverty or access to health care?
Well, I was an advocate of two things on climate when I was at the White House, one of them more strongly. One of them is to move away from the current cafe system and have a fee-based system that would encourage fuel efficiency within categories of automobiles, so that if you bought a gas guzzler within a kind of light truck category, you'd pay a tax, and if you bought a car that got good gas mileage within that category, you'd get a rebate, and it would be they would be equal. I mean, as far as financially.
And what if you bike to work?
Well, maybe, I don't know.
It's good to hear you endorse tax and spend.
Right, well, it is. But that's a good market-oriented solution to something like this, because then actually your average moves up over time, because you're encouraging people to purchase below above the average. Okay, and so you don't get these command and control systems. And if you're going to be serious about these questions, you have to deal with gasoline consumption. Okay, and you have to deal with electricity production. Okay. And I support a cap and trade system on this, and for the best free market reasons, because right now the production of carbon is a free good. you didn't pay any cost for it. And so there's, the eventual solution to this is not going to be a command and control solution. It's going to be a technological solution. We're going to have a technological way to produce electricity from coal while preventing the emissions of carbon. Okay? But right now, there's no financial incentive to produce that technology. So a cap-and-trade system would essentially create a financial incentive for the production of new technology. And the good thing about that is, even though America's, reductions in American production on these things would have almost no influence on global warming, the technology then could be used by the Chinese and the Indians and the Mexicans. And this is one of what we contribute as a kind of value in the world market to these kind of technological innovations. So that seems like me a pretty good example. I've supported efforts with asset-based welfare reforms within the White House, which were, one of the, we still have problems in differentials between wages between whites and minorities in America, but they've closed over time. Okay, the huge disparity in America that we have is on wealth. I have the figures in the book. I don't remember exactly, but I think average white family has something like $140,000 in wealth. Average African American family, $20,000 or $30,000 in wealth, which puts them in a much more fragile economic situation. If you have downturn, lose a job, you can really lose everything. Okay. So I promoted the idea of starting accounts at birth that would be subsidized for low-income people in America, that would use the miracle of compound interest to try to...
The Hillary Clinton idea.
Yeah, I like it. Well, I can't help it, but I mean, she took after me. So, but
Gerson endorses Clinton, praises Europeans in dealing... Yeah.
Well, actually, it was...
And endorses taxes.
It was a Tony Blair idea. Because this kind of kid save idea. I view that as a conservative idea, to build wealth, independence, kind of encourage dignity. Just like we encourage home ownership, which is a good thing, and just like we should do more to encourage savings through individual development accounts and a variety of these other things. So I don't think these things are hopeless. I think there are actually some interesting ideas out there about how you could achieve ends of social justice through means that are not centralized and bureaucratic.
EJ, I'm told we have 4 minutes.
All right, why don't I think there are a bunch of good questions here. Let me give you all 3, and you can deal with them, I suppose, evade the ones. Now, somebody help me, because I don't want to mispronounce this dear person's name. Jason Biasi?
From the Christian
From
Century.
the Christian Century.
Yes.
And this was a question dear to my heart. Reinhold Niebuhr taught, based on St. Augustine, that Christians ought to be the first people to suspect their own motivation, even or especially when they think they're at their best. How can we be sure of our very good, our very good motives don't blind us to unintended consequences born of our own hubris?
Right.
That's
Well,
a superb...
actually, let me answer it, because I think it's important.
That's a very important question.
Yeah, it is. One of my favorite Chesterton quotes, he says that we should be certain about the truth and uncertain about ourselves. Okay, I think that that's actually a pretty good combination. I think a kind of a humility that makes people cynical and passive is a dangerous thing. That's certainly not the motivation of a kind of William Wilberforce or a Martin Luther King. Okay, these were people that had a kind of passionate concern for the ideal and truth of human dignity, and that laws should respect it. I think that history advanced on their certainty, indomitable certainty. So and I wouldn't want to remove that element. But when it comes to the strategies and applications of ideals, there should be a kind of a humility on that. I think we need to, maybe some of that might have been more useful on Iraq in considering some of the outcomes and problems, even when you have good motivations. But let me give you the flip side. My experience after Katrina, okay, which revealed people who had never had a bank account, who had no connection to the mainstream economy of any kind. We had Republicans that were just interested in cost offsets, and Democrats who were just interested in the apportionment of blame. You had very little confrontation of this basic issue of kind of durable American issue of race and poverty. The problem there wasn't too much conviction in our system. It wasn't too much idealism that we're going to deal with these problems. It was actually a kind of deep-rooted indifference to these questions. So it really depends, in a lot of ways. In the letter from the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King talks about being an extremist for truth. And I think sometimes that has to happen.
EJ,
I hate to, well, let me just say
we're out
that
of
there are
time.
2 Christianity Today questions that you might send online, because we're supposed to cut it off, but we should not ignore our friends at Christianity Today, and you wouldn't want to.
No, not at all.
We'll be sure that you get a copy. Ladies and gentlemen, could we just close by me saying that here's a copy of the book. For those of you watching online, it's called Heroic Conservatism. We'll do like book TV and hold the book up for the camera.
I appreciate that.
And of course, all of us are grateful for Michael taking the time out of his busy book tour and schedule to come over several blocks to be with us here at the Pew Forum. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, EJ. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.